On the morning of July 24th, 1948, a maid knocked on a bedroom door at 15 DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. She knocked once, then again, louder. Then she opened the door. The woman inside was dead. She had 60 rooms. She died in one of them, alone, on a summer morning, while the city outside went about its business, and the staff moved quietly through the hallways below, not yet knowing. Her name was Eleanor Medill-Patterson, Cissy, to the people who thought they knew her. She owned the house outright. She owned a country estate in Maryland, a ranch in Wyoming, and a newspaper that had spent decades telling Washington what to think. She had married a European count. She had hosted presidents. She had fired men twice her age without raising her voice. And she died with no one in the room. The funeral drew a crowd. Politicians, journalists, society figures who had once competed for a seat at her table. The pews filled. The eulogies were careful. But the room felt hollow in a way that had nothing to do with numbers. Her daughter sat toward the back and did not cry. Her brother had been dead for 2 years. The estates she left behind would spend months being declined by organizations that didn't want the maintenance costs. 60 rooms. Beautiful. Empty. A problem for lawyers to solve. This is not a success story. It is something more uncomfortable than that. A story about what happens when every advantage is given, every door is opened, every privilege is inherited, and something essential is missing from the very first day. Eleanor Medill-Patterson was born on November 7th, 1881, in Chicago, into a family that had never needed to explain itself to anyone. Her grandfather, Joseph Medill, owned the Chicago Tribune. Her father, Robert Wilson Patterson, would eventually run it. Her mother came from the same dynasty, a marriage that consolidated power rather than created it, two fortunes deciding to become one. The house was large. The staff was constant. The money was simply there, the way oxygen is there, unremarkable, invisible, assumed. What was not there was warmth. Cissy's mother was cold in a way that felt less like personality and more like policy. Eleanor Medill-Patterson, the elder, did not embrace her daughter with any regularity. She corrected her. She adjusted her. She reminded her, repeatedly, that she was not yet acceptable, but might become so if she worked harder at becoming someone else. The approval was always conditional. It was always just out of reach. That was perhaps the point. Her father existed at a different kind of remove. Robert Patterson lived behind the newspaper, behind closed doors, behind conversations his daughter was not invited to join. When he looked at Cissy at all, it was with the mild, distracted interest of a man noticing a piece of furniture placed in the wrong room. He was busy. He was important. He had things that mattered more. Her brother, Joseph Medill-Patterson, Joe, was older and male, and therefore already inheriting the full weight of the family's attention and ambition. It wasn't that Cissy was less capable. Everyone who watched her understood she wasn't less capable. But she was female, and the rules about that were very simple, and no one in the household seemed to find them worth questioning. She orbited Joe. She wanted his attention. She rarely got it. The household ran on precision, meals at specific times, governesses arriving and departing on schedule, tutors for French, for history, for penmanship. Cissy learned to sit still for hours. She learned how to enter a room. She learned that her thoughts were considered less interesting than her appearance, and that both were being evaluated constantly by people who never explained what they were looking for. There were parties, grand ones, but they weren't for her. She would watch her mother descend the staircase in gowns that cost more than most families earned in a year, leaving for rooms where decisions were made and alliances were sealed. Cissy stayed behind. She watched from the stairs. She understood, without being told, that her own value would eventually be determined by a single transaction, and that everything she was being taught was preparation for it. She was not rebellious about this. She was something quieter and more damaging, watchful. She studied the adults around her, trying to decode the criteria. She learned to smile on cue. She learned when silence was the safer choice. She learned that wealthy people never discussed money directly, and that every interaction was shaped by it nonetheless. In 1893, when Cissy was 12, her grandfather Joseph Medill died. The family gathered. There was mourning, but it was structured, formal, as though grief itself needed to observe proper etiquette. Important men attended. The Tribune ran long tributes. The estate was divided. The machine continued. What Cissy noticed, what she filed away, was that no one seemed to miss him as a person. They mourned his authority, his position. They spoke about what he'd built, not who he'd been. It was her first clear lesson in the family's true currency. A person was valued for their function, and forgotten the moment the function ended. Her mother grew more rigid after his death. More corrections, more reminders that Cissy needed to prepare herself for society, for evaluation, for the moment she would be presented to a man whose family found the Pattersons acceptable. The age was approaching. The clock was running. Her education was, in certain ways, exceptional. Multiple languages, European history, the complete architecture of social performance. But it was entirely absent in others. She was taught to speak French. She was not taught to ask difficult questions in any language. She learned the rules of every room she might enter. She was not taught to notice when the rules of a room were designed to keep her in it. Everything she was given reinforced one idea. A woman's life was something that happened to her, not something she built. She read novels when she could. She was drawn to stories where women ran, where they defied what was expected, where they made choices that were actually theirs. But those were stories. In her actual life, there was a script, and no one in her household presented deviation as an option. By the time she was 14, Cissy Patterson had absorbed a loneliness that had no visible cause and no available name. She lived in a house full of people and felt entirely alone. Her family controlled one of the most powerful newspapers in the country, could make or destroy reputations with a single editorial decision. And none of that power extended to her in any meaningful way. It belonged to the men. She would be transferred eventually to another man in another house, where the loneliness would continue under a different name. She tested the edges sometimes. A sharp remark at dinner, a refusal to wear a particular dress. Her mother's response was always swift and always cold. Cissy learned that resistance produced isolation, and isolation was the one thing she couldn't bear. So the resistance went inward. The anger found no exit. It simply accumulated. She was pretty. Everyone said so. It was meant as a compliment. She received it as an appraisal. Her looks were an asset to be managed, deployed at the right moment, spent in the right transaction. Beauty, she came to understand, was just another form of currency in this family. And like all their currency, it would eventually be spent on something she hadn't chosen. At 15, Cissy Patterson stood at the threshold of her formal debut into society. She had been trained, prepared, polished until she reflected exactly what the world expected to see. But underneath the silk and the posture and the carefully maintained smile, something was already broken. Something that all the money, all the rooms, all the power of the Patterson name had never come close to fixing. She didn't know it yet, not fully, not in words, but the breaking had only just begun. Cissy Patterson made her debut into society in 1901. She was 19 years old, and she had been prepared for this moment since before she could remember. It did not feel like an arrival. It felt like being placed on a stage and handed a script she hadn't been allowed to read in advance, while everyone else in the room already knew every line. The debutante season in Washington and New York was not a celebration. It was a market. Young women were presented, evaluated, and sorted according to criteria that were never written down and never needed to be. Everyone understood them perfectly. The white gowns, the arranged hair, the seven-course dinners, where the rules about which fork to use and when to speak, and how much wine a young woman should be seen drinking, were enforced by the collective surveillance of every person in the room. Cissy's gown was perfect. Her hair was immaculate. She looked, by every available measure, like exactly what she was supposed to be. A beautiful girl from a powerful family, positioned for the right kind of marriage. At the balls, men she had just met assessed her while they danced with her. She could feel it, the way their eyes moved, the calibration happening behind their polite conversation. Bloodlines, temperament, appearance. Whether the Patterson newspaper access was worth the complication of the Patterson personality. She was pretty and connected, and came with access to one of the most powerful media dynasties in the country. That, ultimately, was the evaluation. Not who she was, what she came with. Her mother watched from the edges of every event with the focused intensity of someone whose own reputation was on the line. After each party, in the carriage home, in the hallway outside Cissy's bedroom, the debriefings. She had laughed too loudly. She had failed to engage sufficiently with a young man whose family owned railroads. She had looked bored during a conversation about yachting. Nothing was ever quite right. The corrections were delivered in the same even tone her mother used for everything, not angry exactly. Just perpetually, methodically disappointed. There was one man, briefly, who seemed like something else. His name was Frederick McLaughlin, and he was charming in a way that felt unperformed, genuinely curious, actually funny, the kind of man who asked questions and then waited for the answers as though they might matter. They talked at a dinner in New York. For a moment, just a moment, Cissy allowed herself to imagine that marriage might be something other than a more permanent version of what she was already living. Her mother ended it in a conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes. Frederick's family had money, but not the right kind. Not Patterson money. Not the kind that justified the alliance. He was not an option. Cissy did not argue. She had learned by then that arguing changed nothing. Frederick disappeared from her life as efficiently as he had entered it, and she returned to the rotation of acceptable suitors, men who bored her completely and regarded her with the detached interest of someone reviewing a property listing in a desirable neighborhood. The months passed, the pressure compounded. Other girls from her debut season were getting married. Announcements appeared in the society pages, and her mother would show them to Cissy without comment, the implication requiring no elaboration. Time was moving. Cissy was not getting younger. Failure to secure a marriage reflected on everyone. In 1902, she met Count Joseph Gizicki at a party in Washington. He was Polish, titled, 15 years her senior. He had an estate in Europe and spoke several languages, and paid attention to Cissy in a way that felt, after months of tepid assessment from American suitors, almost overwhelming. He was intense. He sent flowers the next day. He wrote letters. He looked at her across rooms as though she were the only person in them. And for a young woman who had spent her entire life feeling like an afterthought, that specific quality of attention was not a small thing. It was intoxicating. It was almost enough to feel like being seen. Her mother approved immediately. A count was better than a businessman. European nobility carried a weight that American wealth, however substantial, couldn't quite replicate. The Patterson family had money. Joseph had a title. Together, the combination suggested elevation, the kind of story that played beautifully in the society pages. Eleanor began planning before Cissy had fully decided. During the courtship, Joseph was everything a man in his position was expected to perform. Opera, long dinners, descriptions of his estate in Poland delivered in a way that made isolation sound like romance, made distance from Washington sound like freedom. He told her things would be different there, that she would have room to breathe, that the surveillance and the criticism and the exhausting performance of being a debutante who hadn't yet secured her future, all of it would be behind her. She wanted to believe him. She was 22 years old and she was tired. Tired of being evaluated and found lacking. Tired of her mother's corrections and her father's indifference, and the grinding, relentless work of existing inside a life that had been designed by other people for purposes that had nothing to do with her. Joseph looked like a door-marked exit. In January 1904, she accepted his proposal. The announcement ran in every major newspaper. Eleanor was satisfied. Robert Patterson was satisfied. The transaction had been completed successfully. Cissy was to become a countess. But the night after the engagement was announced, standing in her bedroom, surrounded by congratulations she couldn't quite feel, something registered that the courtship's momentum had obscured. Joseph's attentiveness had an edge she hadn't let herself examine. The intensity wasn't just romantic, it was proprietary. He wanted to know where she was at all times. He made decisions without asking. He spoke about their future as though it were a blueprint he'd already drawn, and she was the one element whose input had not been factored in. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself all men were like this. She told herself the invitations had already been printed, and it was far too late to reconsider. The wedding was April 14th, 1904, St. Paul's Church, Washington. Senators, judges, newspaper magnates, representatives of European aristocracy who had crossed an ocean for the occasion. The Chicago Tribune described Cissy as radiant. She was not radiant, she was terrified. But terror in her world was something you covered with a smile and a gown that cost more than most families earned in a decade. The honeymoon began in Paris. Expensive hotels, French menus, jewelry purchased without discussion of price. It should have been romantic. Instead, from the first days alone with him, she felt the shape of what she had actually agreed to. He wanted to know where she was every hour. He chose her clothes. He decided their itinerary, their social engagements, their daily movements. And when she expressed a preference that differed from his, the warmth withdrew. Quietly, completely. A coldness settling over him like weather. By the time they arrived at his estate in Poland, she understood she had made a mistake. The estate was called Nowosyelica, remote, surrounded by fields and dense forests, hours from any city. The house was large and decaying. The servants spoke Polish and Russian, languages Cissy didn't know. She listened to Joseph address them and understood his tone without needing the translation. It was the voice of a man who had never doubted his right to absolute authority over everyone in his proximity. There was no social calendar, no neighbors to visit, no shallow distraction of the kind that had at least given structure to her life in Washington. There was only the estate and the servants and Joseph, whose moods determined whether any given day would be tolerable or something worse. He began hitting her within the first year. Not constantly. That, in its own terrible way, might have been easier to name. The violence was unpredictable, sometimes following arguments, sometimes arriving after nothing at all, after no provocation she could identify or correct. He never acknowledged it. He never apologized. The bruises faded. Life continued. And Cissy learned to move carefully through the house, reading the atmosphere the way you read weather, always watching for the signs. She wrote letters home. She tried, in those early months, to explain what was happening. But how do you tell your mother, the woman who arranged the marriage, who planned the guest list, who was satisfied with the transaction, that the Count is not what he appeared to be? How do you admit that the escape was worse than what you escaped from? The letters became vague. Weather, the estate, pleasantries. Her mother wrote back about minor social inconveniences in Washington, as though Cissy were on an extended vacation and simply hadn't gotten around to coming home. In 1905, she became pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult. No doctor nearby, a local midwife who spoke no English. Joseph expected her to manage the household, to appear at meals, to fulfill her obligations regardless of how she felt. The servants watched her with expressions she couldn't read. Pity, maybe, or simple recognition, that this was how these marriages worked, that this was not exceptional, that no one was coming. The baby was born in January 1906, a daughter. Cissy named her Felicia. And looking at this child, this small, new person who had arrived into the same walls, the same remoteness, the same man, something shifted in Cissy Patterson that would never fully shift back. She was not just trapped anymore. Now someone else was trapped with her. The birth was long and brutal, and when it was over, Cissy lay in a room in a decaying Polish estate and looked at the child they placed in her arms. A daughter. She named her Felicia. And in that first moment of looking, really looking, something settled over Cissy Patterson that had nothing to do with exhaustion or relief. It was recognition. This child had been born into the same walls, the same silence, the same man. Felicia hadn't chosen this any more than Cissy had. She had simply arrived into it, the way Cissy once had, small and new and entirely without defense. Joseph was disappointed it wasn't a son. He said so directly. That was one thing you could say about him. He never bothered to soften what he felt. He began traveling more after Felicia's birth. Vienna, St. Petersburg, other cities, other business, other women, Cissy suspected, though she couldn't prove it, and had learned that suspicion without proof was just another form of loneliness she had to carry alone. When he was gone, the house breathed differently. She could hold Felicia without waiting for the criticism. She could move through the rooms without reading the air. Those stretches of his absence were the closest thing to peace she had known since the wedding, which told her everything she needed to know about the marriage. But he always came back. In 1907, Cissy's mother came to Poland. Medill-Patterson arrived with trunks full of American comforts and a long list of complaints about the journey. She stayed 2 weeks, and for the first time in years, Cissy had someone in the house she could actually speak to. Someone from before. She tried. She showed her mother the library where Joseph had locked her during an argument. She described the rages, the pattern of them, the way you learn to anticipate without ever being able to prevent. She asked, as directly as she had ever asked her mother for anything, for help. Elena listened with the expression of someone being informed of a minor scheduling conflict. All marriages required adjustment, she said. Joseph was under considerable pressure, managing an estate, maintaining a title. Cissy was perhaps too sensitive, too American, not fully appreciating the different expectations of European aristocracy. And divorce, that was not a conversation they were going to have. The Patterson family did not produce scandals. When her mother's carriage disappeared down the drive, Cissy stood at the window and understood something that geography had been obscuring. She was not just alone in Poland, she was alone everywhere. The ocean between her and Washington was not the barrier, her own family was. By 1908, she had stopped pretending, not to Joseph. That performance she maintained out of pure survival, but to herself. The marriage was not going to improve. Her family was not going to intervene. And watching Felicia, watching this small child learn to go quiet when her father entered a room, learn to flinch at the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, Cissy felt endurance curdle into something it couldn't remain. Endurance, she understood, was just complicity with more patience. She began to plan. She skimmed money from the household accounts carefully over months. She wrote to her brother Joe, more directly than she had dared before, stripped of the vagueness she'd used to protect him from the truth. She contacted a lawyer in Vienna. She gathered documents, marriage certificates, financial records, anything that might matter later. Joseph found the letters. He always found things. He confronted her in the library in March 1908, the same room where he'd once locked her in. And he was very calm about it, which was worse than when he wasn't. He told her she would never see Felicia again if she tried to leave. He told her no court in the world would side with an American woman against a Polish count on Polish soil. He told her she had no power, no options, and no exit. On one of those counts, he was wrong. There was money he didn't control, money her family had given her before the wedding, held in her name, beyond his reach. It wasn't much, by Patterson standards. It was enough. In April 1908, while Joseph was traveling, Cissy packed what she could carry, took Felicia, and left Nova Sialitsa. She made it to Vienna. She bought passage on a ship. She spent the entire crossing waiting for someone to board and tell her to turn back, that Joseph had sent word that she was being returned, that the Count's reach extended even here across open water. Nobody came. In May 1908, she stepped onto American soil with her daughter and almost nothing else. She believed, for that brief, bright moment, that the worst was behind her. Washington received her like a problem that had returned. Her mother's expression when they met said everything Eleanor chose not to say aloud. The look of someone whose prediction had been proven correct and who found no satisfaction in it. Her father was more explicit. He called Cissy into his study the day after she arrived and explained, in measured tones, that her situation was an embarrassment, that leaving a titled husband reflected poorly on the family, that she needed to consider what this meant for the Tribune's social standing. Cissy told him about the violence. Robert Patterson listened without expression. When she finished, he told her that marriage was difficult for everyone and that she had made a commitment she was now abandoning. He did not ask to see bruises. He did not say that what Joseph had done was wrong. He said that Cissy's decision to leave had created a problem, and the problem was hers to manage. She moved into the family home with Felicia. The house that had suffocated her childhood now felt like the only shelter available, which was its own particular form of defeat. The gossip in Washington had already begun. The countess who fled her marriage, the Patterson girl who couldn't hold it together. The same women who had filled the pews at her wedding now dissected her failure over afternoon tea with the focused pleasure of people who had been waiting for exactly this. In August 1908, Cissy filed for divorce. Joseph contested everything. He sent lawyers and letters that described Cissy as mentally unstable, as an unfit mother, as a woman who had abandoned her obligations and abducted his child. The case moved slowly through courts that had no clear framework for an international marriage, a Polish count, and an American woman who had fled across a continent with a 3-year-old. Felicia asked about her father sometimes. Cissy changed the subject. How do you explain to a child that small what danger looks like in a person who is supposed to love her? The divorce was granted in 1909. Cissy felt something loosen in her chest. Brief, clean relief. It was over. She had documentation. She was free. She was not free. Joseph refused to recognize the American ruling. Polish courts sided with him. The marriage, they said, remained valid under Polish law. Felicia was legally required to be returned to her father. Cissy ignored it. She was in America. He was in Poland. She told herself that the Atlantic Ocean was enough. It wasn't. In March 1910, Joseph arrived in Washington. She didn't know he was in the country until he appeared at the family home with a lawyer and a Polish court order. American authorities weren't sure what to do with it. The order wasn't enforceable, but Joseph had money and connections and a talent for making situations as loud and complicated and public as possible. More lawyers, more motions, more months. Then, in August 1910, Cissy took Felicia to a resort in the Berkshires, trying to give her daughter a few days of something ordinary, and left her with a governess one afternoon to attend to correspondence. When she came back, the governess was frantic. There had been a man, she said, someone who claimed permission to take the child for a walk. Felicia was gone. Joseph had taken her. He had waited, with patience Cissy now understood was predatory, for exactly the right moment of lowered guard. By the time she understood what had happened, they were already on a ship to Europe. What followed was more than a year of pursuit across a continent. Tips, rumors, cities arrived at days too late, private investigators, bribes, every favor the Patterson name could generate, none of it fast enough. Joseph moved constantly, staying ahead with the ease of a man operating on home territory, in countries where his title meant something and Cissy's American money meant considerably less. In 1911, she made a deal because there was nothing left to do. Supervised visits, a few weeks a year, at locations Joseph chose. No legal rights. A signed acknowledgement that Felicia's home was with her father. She signed it. The alternative was never seeing her daughter again. When she finally saw Felicia, 6 years old now, speaking Polish more fluently than English, the child looked at her with the polite wariness of someone meeting a distant relative they had been told complicated things about. She tolerated Cissy's presence. She did not reach for her. Cissy returned to Washington in 1912, 31 years old. Divorced. The Patterson name, all its power and reach and decades of influence, had not been enough to protect her from one man who understood that the law, applied correctly, was its own form of violence. Her mother told her to move forward. In the same tone she used to discuss rearranging furniture. Her father had stopped mentioning Felicia entirely, as though the child had been a minor business matter, now closed. Cissy moved into an apartment alone and spent 2 years barely keeping herself upright, declining invitations, drinking more than she should, sitting in rooms that felt less like shelter and more like the place where she had come to understand the full cost of everything. The women of Washington had a new story now, not the countess who fled, the mother who lost. They discussed it carefully, over tea, in drawing rooms she was no longer invited to enter. They married in 1925. Cissy was 43 years old. The courtship had taken years and felt, throughout, less like romance than like two parties negotiating the terms of a contract. Neither was particularly excited to sign. Elmer Schlesinger was a lawyer, wealthy, steady, prominent in the ways that mattered in Washington. He was not volatile. He was not cruel. He did not send flowers or write letters or look at Cissy across rooms as though she were the only person in them. After Joseph, the absence of those qualities was not a disappointment. It was, in its own exhausted way, a relief. Elmer was practical about what he wanted. A wife who understood his world. Someone who could host dinners, manage households, provide the social infrastructure that a man of his position required. He did not offer passion. He offered partnership. And partnership, to a woman who had learned that passion usually arrived with bruises, sounded almost like safety. It wasn't safety. It was just a quieter kind of confinement. The marriage was functional in the way that well-maintained machinery is functional. They lived well. Houses in Washington and New York, staff who kept everything running, dinners for Elmer's colleagues and clients that Cissy organized and hosted, with the competence of someone who had been trained for exactly this since childhood. She wore the right clothes. She made the right conversation. She ensured the meals were prepared correctly and the rooms were arranged appropriately, and that nothing, from the outside, looked like anything other than a successful marriage between two prominent people. They never traveled to Europe. Cissy wouldn't go. Poland, Russia, any country that existed east of Paris. She refused without detailed explanation, and Elmer, to his credit or his indifference, never pressed her on it. They slept in separate bedrooms. This was not unusual for their social class and era, but it was still, in its quiet way, an acknowledgement of distance, of the specific kind of nothing that existed between them when the social performance ended and there was no one left to perform for. They rarely touched. Their conversations lived on the surface of things: household logistics, Tribune news, the social calendar. Cissy went through the motions of intimacy the way she went through the motions of everything, correctly, efficiently, without feeling anything she would have described as real. Elmer came home tired. He was polite. He was, in the abstract way of a decent man who doesn't particularly need emotional connection, kind. He simply had no interest in her interior life, in what she actually thought or felt or carried. She was the wife-shaped element of an otherwise well-ordered existence. As long as that element functioned, he had no complaints. She thought about Felicia constantly. The supervised visits continued, a few weeks a year, at locations Joseph chose, on Joseph's terms, as they had always been. Felicia was growing up in Europe, shaped by her father's version of events and Cissy's enforced absence, and the gap between them widened with every year that passed. By the time Felicia was a teenager, the visits felt less like reunions and more like diplomatic meetings between representatives of countries that had been at war. Polite, careful, entirely hollow. Cissy brought gifts. She asked questions. She tried, with the focused desperation of someone who understood she was running out of time, to show interest in her daughter's life. Felicia received these efforts with a courteous chill that was, unmistakably, her father's. Joseph had done his work thoroughly. The child Cissy had held in a decaying Polish estate, the child she had carried across a continent and fought for through courts in 2 countries. That child looked at her now with the measured distance of someone who had been taught, carefully and over years, that measured distance was what Cissy deserved. Elmer told her, more than once, that she needed to accept it. Let it go. It was unhealthy, he said, to fixate on something she couldn't change. Perhaps it was even better for everyone. Felicia was settled with her father, had a life there, and disrupting that would only cause more problems. Cissy stopped talking to him about it. This was the specific loneliness of the second marriage, not the sharp, visible terror of the first, but something slower and in its own way more defeating. Joseph had been a catastrophe. There was no ambiguity about what he was. But Elmer's particular failure was subtler, and subtlety, Cissy was learning, had its own cruelty. He was simply absent, present in every room and absent from every moment that mattered. There was no conflict because there was no real engagement. They occupied the same address and led entirely parallel lives, and the parallel lines, as any mathematician could tell you, never meet. She began spending more time with her brother Joe. Joe had taken over much of the Tribune's operations by then, and he had opinions, loud, specific, frequently infuriating opinions, about journalism and politics and the direction of the country. They argued constantly. Joe was more liberal than Cissy, more willing to challenge the family's inherited positions, more interested in the world as it was, rather than as their grandfather had understood it. The arguments were real. They had edges. And in a life where almost every interaction had become performance, the realness of fighting with Joe felt like oxygen. He paid attention to what she thought. He pushed back, but he pushed back because her arguments were worth engaging with, because she was, to him, a person with a mind rather than a function with a name attached. It was the most seen she felt by anyone. In 1920, Cissy's mother died. Medill-Patterson had been ill for months, and the death was not a surprise. It was, nonetheless, a rupture. Cissy stood at the funeral and cried, and understood, even as she was crying, that the grief was not exactly for her mother. It was for something her mother had never given her. 40 years of waiting for approval that had been perpetually, deliberately withheld, and now the waiting was simply over. The approval was never coming. That particular hope, small, stubborn, apparently unkillable until now, was finally dead too. The inheritance was substantial. Money and property divided between Cissy and Joe, the kind of resources that arrived with no conditions, no Elmer attached, no man's permission required. The money didn't make her happy. It made her less dependent, which was not the same thing, but was, after everything, not nothing. Something shifted after that. She began, carefully at first, and then less carefully, to stop complying. Elmer wanted her at certain events. She started skipping the ones she found pointless. He expected certain appearances to be maintained. She maintained them selectively, on her own schedule, according to her own judgment. She spent money on things he considered frivolous, enjoyed herself at parties in ways that made him visibly uncomfortable, not because she was causing scenes, but because she had stopped monitoring herself for his benefit, and the absence of that self-monitoring looked to Elmer like a problem requiring correction. His version of correction was the calm, measured lecture. She was embarrassing herself, he said. She was going through some kind of crisis. Her inability to move past the first marriage, past Felicia, past all of it, was affecting her judgment and her behavior, and her capacity to function as the wife his position required. Cissy listened. She did not change. By 1925, the marriage had become purely nominal. They lived in the same house and led entirely separate lives. Elmer, with his work, Cissy, with her inheritance and her brother, and a restlessness that was building towards something neither of them could yet name. They didn't discuss divorce. Elmer had no appetite for scandal, and another divorce would have been exactly that. So they maintained the arrangement, kept the appearances, and stopped pretending to each other that there was anything underneath them. She was in her mid-40s. She had been married twice. Both marriages had failed. The first catastrophically, in fire and violence and the theft of her daughter. The second, slowly, in the particular grey erosion of two people who had nothing to offer each other and had eventually stopped pretending otherwise. She had lost Felicia. She had lost years. She had wealth and position and a Washington address and every external marker of a life that had worked out. And she was alone in a way that had moved, by now, from feeling to fact, bone deep, irreversible. The kind of alone that no amount of dinner parties, or correct appearances, or well-managed households could touch. The restlessness had nowhere to go, until suddenly it did. In 1925, William Randolph Hearst offered Cissy Patterson the editorship of the Washington Herald. She had no journalism experience. She had never held a job in any formal sense. She was a twice-failed wife, a mother estranged from her only child, a socialite who had spent her adult life managing other people's households and attending other people's parties and existing, largely, at the margins of power rather than inside it. She was not the obvious choice. But Hearst wasn't looking for obvious. He needed someone who knew everyone in Washington, who understood, at a cellular level, how power moved through that city, who owed favors and who collected them, which marriages were performances and which reputations were constructed. Cissy knew all of it. She had been studying that world from the outside for 40 years, and she had a very long memory and absolutely nothing left to lose. She accepted, not out of passion for journalism, not out of any particular belief in the press as a democratic institution. She accepted because she had 20 years of accumulated rage and, for the first time in her life, someone was handing her something that might actually hold it. The newspaper was a weapon. She picked it up. The staff at the Herald had prepared themselves for a figurehead, a wealthy society woman who would attend the right lunches, lend the paper her social connections, and leave the actual work to the people who knew how to do it. What they got instead was Cissy Patterson arriving every morning, reading every section, questioning every decision, and learning the mechanics of the operation with the focused attention of someone who understood that knowledge was the only currency that couldn't be taken away. The male journalists resented her immediately. They showed it in the practiced, low-grade way that men in rooms like that have always shown it, talking over her in meetings, routing decisions around her, receiving her suggestions with the patient. Barely concealed amusement reserved for people they had already decided not to take seriously. She noticed. She didn't complain. She fired them. The first editor she dismissed had ignored a front-page story she'd requested. He explained to her, with condescension so thick it had its own weather system, that she didn't quite understand how newspapers worked. She let him finish. Then she told him to clear his desk. The second firing came a week later, for variations on the same theme. By the end of her first month, the staff had reached a collective understanding. She was not there to be managed, and she was not interested in being liked. The Herald she built was sharp, personal, and deliberately unsettling to anyone with something to hide. She ran stories about Washington society that other papers considered too combustible: affairs, financial entanglements, the private hypocrisies of public men. She understood, with the clarity of someone who had been on the receiving end of institutional power for decades, that the people who held it were most vulnerable when their private lives became visible. She had no hesitation about making them visible. Some of it was legitimate: investigations into corruption, into contracts awarded to the connected, into the ways money moved through government without accountability. Good journalism, by any standard. But some of it was something else. There was a senator who had made a joke about Cissy at a dinner party in 1912. Something about unstable women who couldn't hold on to husbands or children. She had heard about it secondhand. She had never forgotten it. In 1926, the Herald ran a detailed series on his financial dealings: construction contracts, favorable arrangements, money moving in directions it had no legitimate reason to move. The senator lost his re-election bid. Cissy never acknowledged the coverage was personal. Everyone who knew her understood it completely. This was the Herald under Cissy Patterson: equal parts accountability journalism and carefully targeted retribution. And the genius of it was that you often couldn't tell which was which until the damage was done. Circulation climbed, advertisers followed. By 1927, the paper was profitable, and Hearst was pleased. But Cissy's social world was contracting in direct proportion to her professional power. The people she had once hosted at dinner stopped accepting her invitations. The Herald was watching them now. Any misstep, any indiscretion, any private arrangement they preferred to keep private, all of it was potential material. Former friends became sources, or targets. The line between those categories blurred until it disappeared. Elmer lasted until 1929. He hated the newspaper, hated that she was working at all, but especially that she was working in ways that generated attention and controversy, and refused to account for his comfort. He told her she was making a spectacle of herself. She told him to leave if he was unhappy. He moved to New York permanently. They didn't divorce, neither wanted the legal theater of it, but they stopped maintaining the pretense that there was anything left to maintain. She didn't particularly notice his absence. In August 1930, Hearst offered to sell her the paper outright. She bought it. She was 48 years old. She had failed at marriage twice. She had lost her daughter to a man a Polish court had decided deserved her more. She had spent 2 decades being evaluated, dismissed, managed, and discarded by people who had underestimated what she was capable of when she had something to work with. Now she owned a newspaper in the capital of the United States, and there was no one left to answer to. She stood in the Herald offices the morning after the purchase finalized, looking at the printing presses, the reporters' desks, the stacks of papers ready for distribution, and understood that this was the first thing in her life that was entirely, unconditionally hers. Not inherited from a grandfather, not granted by a husband, not contingent on performance or approval, or the good opinion of people who had never extended her any. Hers. It was not enough to fix what was broken, but it was enough to ensure she could never again be simply dismissed. Ownership removed the last restraints, and without restraints, the Herald became something rawer, an extension of Cissy's obsessions, her grudges, her hardening political certainties. The business continued to thrive. The content grew more erratic, more personal, more nakedly driven by whatever was consuming her that week. One consuming thing was Alice Roosevelt Longworth, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Washington's sharpest tongue, a woman who had been powerful on her own terms for decades. They had once moved through the same circles. Then Alice made a remark at a dinner party, repeated to Cissy in the slightly exaggerated form that remarks always took in transit. Something about divorced women who confused owning a newspaper with having actual influence. Cissy never confronted her directly. Instead, the Herald Society pages began carrying items about Alice, always oblique, always deniable, always carrying the subtle implication that she was past her prime, trading on her father's legacy, clinging to relevance that had quietly moved on without her. The coverage was petty and perfectly obvious, and Washington watched it the way Washington watched everything, with the delighted attention of people who understood they were seeing something real beneath the performance. Alice fought back with the weapon she'd always had, her wit. She called Cissy the Countess in tones that made the title sound like a punchline. She suggested that owning a newspaper made someone a journalist the way owning a horse made someone a jockey. The feud became social entertainment for an entire city. Two formidable women deploying whatever they had against each other for reasons neither would ever fully articulate. Meanwhile, the Herald's politics curdled. Cissy had always been conservative. By the early 1930s, her conservatism had become something harder and less reasoned, a fury directed at Roosevelt, at the New Deal, at anything that suggested wealth carried obligations beyond personal enjoyment. Reporters were expected to find stories that supported her positions. Stories that contradicted them were killed. When journalists pushed back, she reminded them, simply and finally, who owned the building they were standing in. Several resigned. The ones who stayed learned to write toward her conclusions. She attacked Frances Perkins, Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, the first woman ever appointed to a presidential cabinet, with a particular intensity that revealed more than it was meant to. Perkins had achieved something Cissy never had: legitimate authority, earned through demonstrated competence, granted by institutional merit rather than purchased through inheritance. The Herald questioned her qualifications, her judgment, her fitness for the position. Cissy wrote columns suggesting her gender made her unsuitable for the role. The irony of a woman using her platform to dismantle another woman's power was observed by everyone and acknowledged by no one, least of all Cissy, who would not have experienced it as irony. Through all of it, the firings, the feuds, the hardening politics, the scotch that appeared earlier and earlier in the afternoon, Felicia remained the fixed point that everything else orbited. In 1923, Cissy had arranged for her daughter, then 17, to visit Washington for several weeks, the longest time they'd spent together since the kidnapping. She prepared obsessively, redecorated a bedroom, planned activities, made lists. She wanted Felicia to see past whatever Joseph had told her. She wanted to be recognized as a mother by the person she had most catastrophically failed to protect. Felicia arrived speaking better French than English. She was polite in the way of someone enduring a necessary obligation with minimum visible discomfort. When Cissy tried to talk, Felicia answered in short sentences. When Cissy suggested activities, Felicia complied without enthusiasm. And then Cissy noticed something that stopped her completely. Felicia flinched at sudden movements. She went quiet when voices were raised. She had a way of folding inward during any moment of conflict, disappearing into herself, making herself smaller, waiting for it to pass. Cissy recognized every single one of those behaviors. She had learned them herself, in the same house, from the same man. One evening she tried to say so. She asked Felicia carefully about her father, about what life had been like, about whether Joseph had been kind. Felicia's face closed like a door. Her father had provided everything she needed. She was grateful for her upbringing. She had nothing further to say on the subject. Cissy pressed gently. She said she knew what Joseph was capable of, that she had left because of his violence, that the custody battle had been, at its core, an attempt to protect Felicia from exactly what appeared to have happened anyway. Felicia stood up and left the room. When she came back hours later, she behaved as though the conversation had never occurred. The visit ended early. Obligations in Europe, Felicia said. Cissy suspected she simply couldn't leave fast enough. At the train station, Cissy tried to embrace her daughter. Felicia permitted it briefly, with the stillness of someone waiting for an unpleasant thing to be finished. Then she boarded the train, and Cissy stood on the platform and watched it go and understood, with the specific clarity of a thing you've known for a long time finally becoming undeniable, that the loss of Felicia was not a legal matter anymore. It was permanent in a way no court had ordered. In 1925, Felicia married Drew Pearson. Cissy learned about it from a letter that arrived 3 weeks before the wedding. The ceremony was in Europe. Small affair, family only. Travel would be difficult. She was not invited. She sat with that letter for a long time. She had crossed a continent for this child. She had spent years and a fortune in courts in 2 countries. She had made a humiliating agreement and signed her own defeat just to preserve the right to supervised visits in locations chosen by the man who had hit her. And now Felicia was getting married, and the man who had kidnapped her was family, and the woman who had given birth to her was not. Cissy sent silver from a jeweler in New York, engraved with Felicia's new initials. The thank you note she received was polite and empty, and said nothing that suggested it had been written by someone who felt anything at all. Drew Pearson became a prominent political columnist. His work brought him to Washington regularly, which meant Felicia was sometimes in the city, sometimes for weeks, and did not call. Cissy would learn about these visits the way she learned about everything involving her daughter now, secondhand, at parties, from people mentioning they had seen them at a restaurant. She would stand with a drink and absorb this information and say something appropriate and move on. She could have used the Herald against him. Pearson's columns frequently contradicted her editorial positions. He was liberal where she was conservative, interventionist where she was isolationist, broadly aligned with everything she opposed. She had destroyed people for far less. She never touched him. When his name came up in editorial meetings, when reporters floated stories that might have damaged him, Cissy changed the subject or killed the pitch without explanation. The staff noticed and said nothing. It was the one place where the vindictiveness stopped. The one small, unacknowledged act of protection she could still offer her daughter without her daughter knowing or caring. In 1936, Felicia had a child. A daughter. Cissy read about it in another newspaper. She sent a silver rattle, expensive and impersonal, and received no acknowledgement. She became a grandmother in the same way she had become a countess, on paper technically, without any of the substance the word was supposed to contain. She kept a photograph of Felicia on her desk at the Herald offices. It was from the 1923 visit, one of the few times anyone had convinced them both to stand still for a camera. Felicia looked uncomfortable. Cissy looked desperate. Neither was smiling in a way that suggested happiness. The photograph sat there for years, collecting the fine grey dust of a newsroom, a reminder of the one thing that all the power, all the money, all the front pages in the world had proven completely, permanently unable to fix. When the stock market collapsed in October 1929, breadlines formed in the streets outside Cissy's Washington windows. Families who had been stable lost everything inside of months. Men who had worked for decades stood in lines for soup that charities could barely distribute fast enough. Cissy's fortune was untouched. The Patterson money was held in diversified investments managed by people whose entire purpose was ensuring that disasters affecting everyone else left the right people unaffected. The Herald's revenue dipped slightly as advertising budgets contracted. Her personal income continued at levels most Americans couldn't have imagined in good times, let alone these. She moved into a larger house. In 1931, while America was coming apart at the seams, Cissy Patterson decided her 15-room house felt cramped. She moved into a mansion on DuPont Circle, 60 rooms, formal gardens, quarters for a full staff. She hired architects and decorators and craftsmen imported from Europe, marble from Italy, wood paneling from England, furniture commissioned from designers who worked for actual royalty. The renovations took months and cost a fortune, which is to say they cost nothing, because fortune was the one thing Cissy Patterson had never been required to think about. Outside her windows, Washington was unraveling. Families boiling water to stretch soup further, children wearing shoes with holes their parents couldn't afford to replace, men who had worked their entire lives standing in lines for bread in the capital city of the most powerful nation on earth, in plain sight of people like Cissy Patterson, who was inside, arguing with contractors about the precise shade of paint for a bedroom she would rarely enter. She threw parties, not intimate dinners, productions, professional caterers, orchestras, decorations requiring days to install, 7-course meals served by invisible staff while the unemployment rate climbed past 20%. Champagne and imported wines flowing in rooms that hummed with the casual self-assurance of people who had decided, collectively and without discussion, that what was happening outside was simply not their concern. She was not oblivious. The Herald ran detailed, often sympathetic coverage of the Depression, the breadlines, the failed banks, the human wreckage of economic collapse. Cissy read every edition. She saw the photographs. She simply didn't care enough to alter her behavior, which is a different thing from not knowing, and a worse one. The editorial page, hers, entirely, blamed Roosevelt. Government intervention was prolonging the crisis. Relief programs were manufacturing dependency. The solution was less regulation and more faith in the markets that had just annihilated millions of lives. The Herald's news pages documented the devastation in careful detail. The opinion pages argued daily against helping the devastated. Cissy saw no contradiction in this. She believed facts were for reporters and opinions were for editors, and her opinion was that suffering people should help themselves. And she held that opinion from inside 60 rooms of Italian marble, while her staff polished silver she never used. The staff. Desperate people, most of them, who had taken the work because the alternative was worse. Cooks, maids, groundskeepers, drivers, people maintaining rooms Cissy never entered, sustaining a household built for a social life she was already beginning to abandon. She paid them, which in 1931 Washington was not nothing. But the wages were low and the expectations were absolute. The house had to run perfectly. Meals prepared exactly as specified. Every surface clean. The staff invisible, unless required. When a maid asked for a salary advance because her daughter needed medicine, Cissy said no. Rules were rules. When a cook requested time off to tend to his ill wife, she denied it. She was hosting a dinner party that week. The staff learned not to ask. They learned to absorb what was required and keep their circumstances private, which was, in its way, the same lesson Cissy had learned in a decaying estate in Poland from a man who expected his household to function regardless of how anyone inside it actually felt. She bought clothes during this period that cost more than some families earned in a year. Dresses from Paris, shoes from Italy, furs. She wore them once, sometimes twice, and forgot them. Her closets filled with impulse purchases, objects of beauty that had served their purpose, which was to be acquired, and now simply occupied space. In 1932, veterans marched on Washington. Men who had fought in the Great War, now broke and desperate, and in some cases homeless, demanding early payment of bonuses the government had promised them. They called themselves the Bonus Army. They built camps in the city and petitioned the people in the buildings around them to honor what they were owed. The Herald covered the march with editorial skepticism. Communist agitators, Cissy wrote, were manipulating the veterans. Their demands were unreasonable. Paying the bonuses would bankrupt the treasury. When federal troops, American soldiers, under American orders, drove the veterans from their camps with tear gas and bayonets and burned their makeshift shelters to the ground, the Herald's editorial page supported the action as a necessary restoration of order. Cissy watched none of it directly. She read her reporters' accounts from her office or from her mansion and made decisions about coverage from behind the insulation that sufficient wealth had always provided. The veterans were abstractions to her, problems requiring editorial positions, rather than human beings experiencing the consequences of decisions made by people in rooms exactly like hers. Her brother Joe visited in 1934 and told her she was being reckless. that flaunting wealth during the Depression was generating resentment, that people noticed when newspaper editors lived like European aristocrats while writing editorials about fiscal responsibility. Cissy told him to mind his business. She had earned her money, or inherited it, which she treated as the same thing. Joe pointed out, with the precision of someone who had thought about it beforehand, that she had not earned anything, that she had been born into wealth and had done nothing except continue to possess it. She told him to leave. He did. They didn't speak for months. The parties continued. The renovations continued. The excess continued. And every morning the Herald published new accounts of the Depression's human toll, written by reporters who took the streetcar to work and filed their copy and collected their modest wages and went home to apartments nothing like the one their employer occupied, while their employer decided, from 60 rooms on DuPont Circle, which of their stories about suffering was worth the front page. By the mid-1930s, the Herald had stopped being a newspaper with a perspective and become something closer to an instrument of personal certainty. Cissy's conservatism, always present, had hardened into something that no longer required argument or evidence, only assertion, repetition, and the willingness to fire anyone who pushed back. Roosevelt was the primary target. The attacks were daily, relentless, and increasingly unhinged from policy into something more visceral. She called him a dictator. She compared the New Deal to fascism. This, while actual fascism was organizing itself across Europe with methodical efficiency and genuine murder. She published cartoons depicting him as a tyrant and a fool. She wrote editorials that questioned not just his decisions but his fundamental right to make them. Part of it was ideology, genuine if rigid. She opposed government expansion, intervention in markets, any suggestion that wealth carried obligations beyond personal enjoyment. But part of it was something she would never have admitted, even to herself. Roosevelt had done what Cissy Patterson could not. He had taken an aristocratic background, similar to hers in its essential structure, and transformed it into something people loved. He had leveraged privilege into empathy, and the country had responded with a devotion that no amount of Herald editorials could erode. Cissy had taken the same background and transformed it into contempt, and the country, indifferently, had noticed. She attacked Eleanor Roosevelt with a particular intensity that revealed the wound underneath. Eleanor had built real influence, not through marriage, not through inheritance, but through demonstrated purpose. She used it to advocate for people Cissy believed should simply manage better. The Herald questioned Eleanor's activities, her public statements, her involvement in policy. The coverage was mean in ways that went beyond political disagreement into something more personal, the fury of a woman who recognized in another woman's accomplishment the specific shape of everything she herself had been denied. In 1937, she merged the Herald with another Hearst paper to create the Washington Times-Herald. More resources, wider circulation, greater reach. She used all of it to prosecute a political crusade that was becoming, by now, indistinguishable from a private war. The isolationism consumed her. As Hitler moved through Europe, Austria, Czechoslovakia, then Poland, the Times-Herald argued, edition after edition, that America should stay home. European wars were European problems. The country should protect its own interests. Reporters who suggested Nazi Germany constituted a genuine and specific threat found their stories killed or rewritten before they reached print. Charles Lindbergh became her champion, the famous aviator who had spent the late 1930s touring Nazi Germany, accepting its medals and delivering speeches suggesting that certain racial groups were simply better suited to govern. Cissy invited him to her parties. She published his writings. When critics pointed to his Nazi sympathies, the medal from Goering, the racial theories delivered from American podiums, she dismissed them as interventionist smear campaigns. The Times-Herald defended him with the loyalty she reserved for people who confirmed what she had already decided to believe. Joe came back in 1938 and tried again. He told her she was on the wrong side of history, that defending Lindbergh made her look sympathetic to fascism, that her hatred of Roosevelt was distorting her judgment about Hitler, which was a far more consequential miscalculation. She told him he'd been corrupted by East Coast interventionists, that the Tribune had gone soft, that he didn't understand journalism anymore. Joe told her she was letting personal grievance masquerade as political principle. She told him to leave her house. He left. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, the country where Cissy had once been trapped in a decaying estate while a violent man controlled her every movement, the country whose courts had taken her daughter and handed her to the man who hit her. The Times Herald expressed sorrow about Poland's fate and argued it was not America's responsibility. On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. America was in the war the next morning, and the Times Herald pivoted overnight, from opposing intervention to supporting it, from attacking Roosevelt's foreign policy to endorsing the very posture it had spent years calling warmongering. Cissy kept publishing, she kept writing, but something had cracked beneath the surface of it all. She had spent years in absolute certainty that she could bend events through force of editorial will. She had been wrong, completely and documentably wrong, and the archives of her own newspaper preserved the evidence in permanent detail for anyone who wanted to look. The crusade had failed, the war had come anyway, and the weapon she had built, the paper that was the one thing entirely, unconditionally hers, now felt less like power and more like a record of how badly she had misread everything that mattered. By the 1940s, Cissy Patterson owned 3 properties and inhabited none of them. The DuPont Circle Mansion, 60 rooms, Italian marble, English paneling, required a staff of 15 to maintain. People who polished silver she never used, who prepared meals she sometimes skipped in favor of scotch, who cleaned rooms she hadn't entered in weeks. The house had been built for the kind of entertaining that established a person as a social force in Washington. She had thrown those parties in the early years, hundreds of guests, orchestras, chefs brought in from out of town. But by the 1940s, the guest lists had contracted sharply. The war made excess feel unseemly, and Cissy had spent a decade using her newspaper to make enemies of nearly everyone who might otherwise have accepted an invitation. The people who still came did so for professional reasons, or out of curiosity, or because declining felt more complicated than attending. They were not friends, they were not company, they were participants in a performance that had lost most of its audience. At night, Cissy would sit in the library with a drink and listen to the house around her. Footsteps of servants moving through distant hallways, doors closing in rooms she hadn't visited in weeks. The vast, expensive silence of 60 rooms occupied by one woman who had structured her entire adult life around the acquisition of space and had arrived, finally, at the understanding that space was simply a larger form of alone. The Maryland estate, Dower House, presented the same problem in a different landscape. Hundreds of acres of forests and fields, a substantial house, staff who maintained careful professional distance, and did not ask why she spent so much time staring out windows. She went there on weekends, sometimes for weeks, and the isolation that was supposed to restore her felt instead like the isolation of Novosibirsk, chosen this time and temporary, but recognizable in its essential texture. Too much space, too few people. Rooms decorated for a life she was not living. In Wyoming, she owned a ranch across thousands of acres. The American West, wide skies, mountains in the distance, the romantic fantasy of independence and open land. The main house had been built to look rustic and had cost a fortune, which was Cissy's signature aesthetic. The expensive performance of simplicity. She visited in summer, rode alone across property that stretched further than she could see, and found that beauty at scale was still just beauty, that it could be witnessed but not felt, Not really. Not without someone to witness it alongside you. She collected things during this period. Art that dealers assured her was valuable, first editions of books she would never open, furniture of historical significance she had no particular feeling for, the objects accumulated across the three properties, filling rooms, creating the visual grammar of a cultured and purposeful life. But the collecting was compulsive rather than passionate. She bought things because wealthy people bought things, because objects occupied space in a way that felt, temporarily, like less emptiness, even though the emptiness, once the object was unwrapped and placed and noted, remained exactly as it had been. 3 properties, dozens of rooms, a staff of people paid to be present and trained to be invisible, and Cissy Patterson moving between them, alone in each one, accumulating beauty she couldn't feel and space she couldn't fill, in houses that had every quality a home was supposed to have, except the only quality that would have made any difference.